Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hey everyone, happy Sunday and welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Thank you so much for deciding to spend your precious time with me. Here we are. It's part 5 of Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde. Again, this is part 5. So if you haven't listened to parts 1 through 4, please go back, get caught up, and then rejoin us. And if you have listened, I'm not going to waste any time. As always, I'll rewind the story a little bit to allow you to settle into the narrative. Like beloved Eddie Munson shredding in the Upside Down, it's time to heavy metal. Kinda Murdery starts right now. Despite the most strenuous efforts of officers, killer couple Bonnie and Clyde had escaped again. Personally, I've lost count of how many times. The car Clyde had taken from James was abandoned at Grand Prairie, Texas, but there was no clue as to how the gang had escaped from that point. The day after the brush with Barrows' gang on Airline Road, Sheriff Schmid received an underworld tip that set his force on its toes again. Not a breath of what the information amounted to got outside the inner circle of the sheriff's office, but 2 trusted deputies, Alcorn and Castor, left town. The following day, the sheriff made an electrifying announcement. The mysterious third man in Barrows' gang was under arrest. He had been picked up in Houston, Texas. For several hours, Sheriff Schmid questioned him. Finally, the young desperado broke down. In a 28-page confession, he set down one of the bloodiest tales in the history of American policing. The youth under arrest was W.D. Jones, 17 years old. He'd been with Barrow in all his major gunfights. As evidence that the prisoner was telling the truth, he showed 7 fresh scars, marks of wounds suffered in the battle with the posse at Dexter, Iowa. He also revealed that Clyde Barrow had been badly wounded in that battle, while Buck Barrow, mortally wounded, and his wife Blanche were captured in the same fight. The story that Jones told will have to be briefed here, but the most skeletonized account is enough to make the hair rise on one's head. Starting out as a motor car thief, Jones fell in with Barrow. Lured on by the man's reputation, the youth stuck to him. Soon, Jones saw Barrows shoot down Doyle Johnson in cold blood at Temple, Texas on December 5, 1932. From that moment on, he was entirely under the bandits' domination. Barrow would not allow him to leave. Forcing him by threats of death to stay with him, the bandit leader held him often by force. Sometimes at night he would chain him to trees and handcuff him so he could not escape. Speaking freely, the young desperado told how he'd met Clyde Barrow and Bonnie near the filling station operated by Clyde's father in Dallas a few weeks before Christmas in 1932. "How would you like to take a ride with me?" Barrow had asked. That ride ended in the murder at Temple when the gang was stealing Johnson's car. That night, with blood fresh on his hands, Barrow was joined by Buck Barrow's wife Blanche at a tourist camp outside Temple. Blanche went to town for some bread and eggs, and Clyde and Bonnie Parker planned to rob a grocery store in Temple the next day. "I got cold feet," Jones said, "and I shook my head at Clyde. He became alarmed and jumped up and swung a shotgun into position. He thought I was warning him that something was up. When he learned that I was only scared, he cussed me out for being yellow. I told him I wanted to go home. He answered, 'Well, steal yourself a car and go home then.' But I was afraid to go." Concurrent with Jones' confession, Frank Hardy was still being held for the murder of Johnson. His first trial for the killing resulted in a hung jury, and it was considered that Jones' confession had cleared Hardy. 2 detectives were sent to Dallas to question Jones in connection with the slayings in Joplin. County Prosecutor Ray Watson was instructed to immediately start extradition proceedings against Hardy, who had been named as an accomplice of Barrow and Hollis Hale in the bank holdup at Onarago, Missouri. Hale was sentenced to 20 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary for that crime. Returning to Dallas with Barrow, Jones was not permitted to leave him. 2 weeks later, he accompanied Bonnie and Clyde to Fort Worth, Texas, and witnessed the slaying of Deputy Sheriff Malcolm Davis there. "We'd been at the home of Bonnie's mother," the prisoner said regarding the Davis shooting. "We had half a gallon of liquor and were drinking it pretty freely. Leaving there, we went to Floyd Hamilton's house to see what we could learn about Raymond, who was in jail at Hillsboro. Then we went to Lily McBride's house to ask about some women. She wasn't there, so we took a girl I had home and then went to see Clyde's mother. Later, we went back to Lily McBride's place again. Lily was in Hillsboro to see if she could get Raymond out. Clyde started in carrying his pistol and shotgun strapped to his body. It was dark, but I couldn't see anything, but I heard a pistol shot and then the report of a shotgun. I saw a man fall over. Bonnie had a .41 caliber revolver and she fired it over my shoulder 2 or 3 times. Clyde ran back to the car and we drove away. The escape led toward Grapevine, Texas, according to Jones. Clyde's car mired in the mud near Grapevine and they gave a farmer $3 to pull them out with a team. From there they went to Oklahoma, where they hid for a while in the hills of the eastern part of the state. A little later they went to Missouri, held up a filling station in Springfield, and escaped into Arkansas, where they were joined by Buck and Blanche. From there they went to Joplin. Buck and Blanche occupied one room, Bonnie and Clyde another. I slept on the couch. We'd just driven into the garage that day when Clyde shouted, "It's the law!" Shots began to ring out in every direction. Clyde and Buck were trying to get the garage open, and I ran to help them when a bullet struck me in the head and I went out. The next thing I remember is that I was riding at high speed in a V8 sedan. Clyde was driving and Bonnie and Blanche were taking care of me. They told me 2 officers had been killed. We headed for the Texas Panhandle. The shooting was on Friday and I got no medical attention until Saturday night when they brought me some alcohol and a salve at Amarillo, Texas for the wound on my scalp. From Amarillo, we rambled through a good many states: Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Indiana, and Louisiana. Later in the summer, we were in a Colorado town when we read in a newspaper that they were looking for us in that very town. So we beat it to the east then, going through Kansas and back to Louisiana. While we were in Louisiana, Clyde sent me to steal a Chevrolet car. I did, but instead of going back to him, I came to Dallas and stayed almost a month with my mother. I never expected to join the gang again, but about a month later, I was walking along the street one evening, and who should drive up alongside me but Bonnie and Clyde. They told me I had to get in with them. I was afraid. I could see myself going for a ride. I asked, "Where are we going?" "Just going up in the country," I was told. The next night, we got in a car wreck near Wellington, Texas. I was knocked out, and Bonnie was burned badly. When I came to, Bonnie told me I'd shot a woman in the hand. Mrs. Jack Pritchard, daughter-in-law of Steve Pritchard, who'd gone to the aid of the occupants of the wrecked car, was wounded, as you'll remember, when she knocked on the door of the Pritchard home. The gang had taken possession of the place. Jones continued, telling the story of Sheriff George Corey and Marshal Paul Hardy when they appeared at the farm. While we were getting fixed up at the farmhouse, some officers came out. We caught 2 of them and took them along with us into Oklahoma. Then we went on to Fort Smith, Arkansas. Buck and I set out to steal an automobile down there and took one away from a man along the road. Later, we had a wreck and I got knocked out again. Buck told me he'd killed a man. I guess he did, because we lost no time getting back to Oklahoma. The man who was killed was Marshal H.D. Humphrey of Alma, Arkansas, who, with Deputy Sheriff A.M. Salyers, attempted to stop the Barrow car after the gang had staged a holdup at Fayetteville. Jones continued. A few days later, Buck, I called him Marvin, but Buck and Clyde went out on an expedition and came back with so many guns it looked like they'd robbed a gun factory. There was 46 automatic pistols, and they said they'd robbed an arsenal. They also had a lot of ammunition. From there we went to that tourist camp near Platte, Missouri. The second night we were there, the officers trailed us. A man went to Blanche's cabin and said they were looking for some of the boys. Blanche told him the boys were in the next cabin. I was in that cabin with Clyde and Bonnie, and Clyde whispered to me, "That's the law." So Bonnie hands me the keys to the car and said to start it. Clyde started shooting. I refused to start the car, and Clyde picked me up and carried me outside into the firefight. Buck was shot in the head, and Blanche was carrying him, her arms around his waist. Clyde helped put him in the car, shoved me in, and told the women to get in and lie on the floor. He got in, then backed the car out with one hand, shooting with the other. All the officers were shooting at us. Afterwards, we counted 15 bullet holes in the car, but man, we were lucky. None of us were hit except Buck, and he was hit in the head. 2 back tires went flat before we'd gone far, and we ran on 1 flat and 1 rim. We fled to Dexter, Iowa, where we hid in the woods for 3 or 4 days. Marvin wasn't out of his mind, but he was suffering from his wound. The gang thought I knew too much, so they chained me to a tree to keep me from getting away. Then Clyde went into town the first night we were there and returned with 5 dinners and a dressing for Buck's wound. A couple days later, we roasted some wieners. The next morning, I was roasting the ones left over when Clyde shouted, "The law's coming!" The shooting started before I could straighten up. I ran and got hit by a load of buckshot. I got one in the right hip, one in the little finger, and one in my chest. A bullet went through the calf of my leg, a machine gun bullet in my chest, my left wrist, and my right thumb. I do not know how I am still alive. They knocked me down. Clyde kept yelling at me to start the car. He was shooting all the time. He picked me up and put me in the back seat. Bonnie was in the front seat, squatting low. Clyde started the car. Before we'd gone far, the car hung up in a stump. Clyde told me to get out with a rifle and pry it loose. We couldn't get the car loose, so we started running through the woods. He made me carry Bonnie half a mile after she was hit. While we hid in the woods, Clyde started toward a farmhouse, but he got in another gun battle and came back with 3 wounds. After this fight at Dexter, we went through Minnesota, Nebraska, Colorado, Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Mississippi. The graphic story told by Jones was of considerable value to the officers. It cleared up points about the movements of the gang that previously had only been guessed at, and it was remarkable that so few of the guesses had been wrong. And yet, even though they'd apparently been guessing right all along, Bonnie and Clyde just kept on getting away. And it was also evident that Jones had been just a tool of the gang. He obviously had been badly frightened, not because of what he feared at the hands of the law, but because of what he feared at the hands of Clyde Barrow. He begged to be kept in jail. He wanted a life sentence, just anything that would keep him permanently out of the reach of the murderous bandit gang. While the veil of mystery had been swept away from the mysterious third man in the gang, the major problem, the capture of Bonnie and Clyde themselves, remained as far from a solution as ever. All the old-time good luck still rode on the shoulders of Barrow, without doubt now the most widely sought outlaw in America. Clyde was even more wanted than the notorious Charles Pretty Boy Floyd. While occasional tips were to the effect that Barrow was here or that Barrow was there, no definite word came from him until January 3, 1934. That day, Monroe Rutan, an ex-convict, was arrested at Houston, Texas. After long police grilling, he admitted that he had fenced bonds taken in a bank robbery at Shiro, Texas, the night of February 20, 1933, through a Kansas City, Missouri politician. Further questioning drew from him that he had participated in the robbery as well, having as companions Clyde Barrow and a man whose name he didn't know. Officers believed the man probably was Jones. The night of January 15, 1934, Ralph Hiley, a Kansas City, Missouri detective, was visiting his wife's father, William Gilmore, at Grand Saline, Texas. About 7:15, he heard someone trying to start his car, which was parked in front of his house. Hiley stepped onto the front porch. Beside his car was another car, a Ford with a man in the rumble seat and a woman at the wheel. Not suspecting the identity of his callers, Hiley walked out to the car and asked what was going on. Then he noticed a second man standing at the door of his car. The detective asked no questions. The face was all too familiar. He'd seen it looking out from scores of police circulars. He was facing Clyde Barrow. "Who wants to know what's going on?" Barrow asked. "Is this your car?" Barrow nodded his head toward the Ford. Hiley looked. Bonnie Parker was smiling down the barrel of a submachine gun. "Well," Hiley said, recalling that his pistol was in the car Barrow was stealing, "I guess I might as well go on back in the house." "That would be the best thing for you to do," the outlaw replied. 150 miles from Grand Saline is the Eastham, Texas State Prison Farm. Here, in river bottoms densely covered by brush, Clyde Barrow had spent a part of his first prison sentence, and here he was fated to write another bloody chapter of his life story. The tract lies in deep southeast Texas. It is near the little town of Weldon and lies along the Trinity River. The morning of January 6, 1934, Raymond Hamilton, early crime partner of Barrow, was among the convicts laboring on the place. The outlook was hopeless for Hamilton. Sentences totaling 263 years faced him. Nevertheless, he seemed to be filled with a suppressed excitement. A new hope seemed to burn in his eyes as Olin Bozeman, prison guard, took a squad of 17 men from their quarters. Hamilton, originally assigned to another squad, attached himself to Bozeman's group as the convicts marched out into the foggy morning. Day had not fully broke. The men were shadowy figures in the early light. The men had not yet started their work when Major Joseph Crowson of the prison guards noticed while on a round of inspection that Hamilton was in the wrong squad. Crowson walked up to Bozeman. "Send a guard captain with Hamilton and see that he gets into his own squad." As the guard walked up to Hamilton, the convict darted into the center of the convict group. Bill Palmer, a convict, slipped up to Major Crowson and Bozeman. Thrusting a pistol against Bozeman, he demanded, "Stick 'em up, boys!" Whirling on the prisoner, Major Crowson tried to grab his gun, but he was not quick enough. Cursing, Palmer fired a shot into Crowson's abdomen. Quickly mounting his horse, Bozeman returned the fire. At that moment, a new note, fearsome and deadly in the fog, entered the combat. Man, this is where I want to go. Dun dun dun. Alright, we're back. Thank you again for taking the time to support the brands that support Kinda Murdery. As I often mention, I'd love to create a community here where we can all share the unique experiences and stories that are connected to our lives, especially those of us who may have, as I do, a disability. So if you or someone you know has a disability, physical or otherwise, and would like to make a connection and share their story or just have a chance to be heard, please don't hesitate to reach out to the show, kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on all social media. Also, please remember that there's a 3-digit number, 988, that you can call to receive counseling for suicidal thoughts, mental health, or substance abuse-related issues. Please, if you're in acute crisis, call 988 to speak to someone who cares immediately. And if you're not in acute crisis, but you'd still love to connect with someone, don't hesitate again to reach out to the show, kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on social media. I'm here. I care. I'd love to talk to you. And please always remember that you are loved. Also, everybody, don't forget that I have awesome full-color vinyl Kinda Murdery stickers to give away. If you'd like one, reach out to me in all the ways just mentioned, and I'll be more than happy to send it to you. And please do leave reviews. They don't just make me feel good. They trigger algorithms that make the show more visible on podcasting platforms and help us to grow our Kinda Murdery community. Of course, I hope that the community itself isn't Kinda Murdery, but that is the name of the show. And with that, let's get back to Part 5 of Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde. Kinda Murdery resumes now. Palmer fired a shot into Croson's abdomen. Quickly mounting his horse, Bozeman returned the fire. At that moment, a new note, fearsome and deadly in the fog, entered the combat. 2 dim, ghostly figures rose from the ravine less than 50 yards from the party. A blaze of machine gun fire streaked the air. Bullets thudded into Croson. Bozeman was knocked from his horse, a bullet at his hip. Struggling to his knees, he aimed at one of the shadowy figures. Before he could fire, a bullet whipped the gun from his hand. Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker were firing into prisoners and guards alike. They were shooting from a trench-like gully. Only a small number of the convicts appeared to have had advance warning of the trouble and knew what to do. As guards shouted for their charges to lie down, Hamilton, Palmer, Henry Methvin, W.H. Bybee, and J.B. French, all desperate long-termers, rushed to the side. Protected by the barrage of machine gun fire, they ran toward Barrow and dropped into the ditch beside him. Now the gang had things their own way. The only available guards were down. Major Croson was badly wounded. Bozeman was helpless. Leading the gang through the undergrowth with which he had become familiar while serving his own term, Clyde Barrow reached 2 cars parked beside the road. Motors roared. The cars sped away. Clyde, Bonnie, and Bonnie's old sweetheart Raymond Hamilton fled in a coupe. The 4 other convicts escaped in a sedan. Prisoners carried the wounded men to the office where they were given emergency treatment, and an intensive hunt was started for Barrow and the escaped convicts. Frank J. Blake, head of the Division of Investigation, Department of Justice at Dallas, started out with 3 of his men to meet Barrow, all superbly armed. Hundreds of well-armed state and county officers were enlisted in the gigantic search. Major Croson was rushed to a Huntsville hospital where surgeons recognized that the only chance of saving his life lay in an immediate operation. It was found that Bozeman's wounds were not dangerous, and he soon recovered. Meanwhile, W.W. Wade, warden of the state prison at Huntsville, broadcast an alarm by telephone. Within a few minutes, he learned that a car, apparently bearing the bandits, had passed through Lovelady and headed north. It appeared that the gang was trying to make Dallas, hometown of both Barrow and Hamilton. Lee Simmons, general manager of the Texas state prison system, started an investigation. He was assisted by B.B. Monzigo, manager of the prison farm. While bloodhounds tore through the underbrush on the bare chance that some of the escaped men might be around, officers questioned prisoners who had heard the whine of Barrow's bullets. It was learned that the delivery had been carefully prearranged. Barrow had watched a group at work the day before. He knew from his own experience that their task was not finished and that they would be back at the same place early the next morning. Just exactly how Barrow got word to Hamilton that he would try to effect his release wasn't learned. But the prisoners knew that when the gang went to work that morning, 3 revolvers were waiting in a brush pile. Hamilton obtained them and distributed them to men he felt he could trust, and waited. Meanwhile, as the search went on, Major Croson failed to rally from the emergency operation. He continued to grow weaker, until finally, on January 27th, he died. The bloody Barrows had killed their 9th man. The entire Southwest was demanding that their career be brought to an end. Hours of heated search failed to reveal any additional trace of the escaped killers. Inasmuch as the group would be large enough to be noticed if it stayed together, and since Barrow was known to trust few men, officers soon inclined to the theory that the company had broken up. Barrow, Hamilton, and Bonnie Parker probably stayed together. Realizing that there might be some mistake in the information as to the method of the escape, officers did not stop their checking of the territory immediately surrounding the prison farm. Disappointing as it was, the trail soon grew cold. Police officers over the entire Southwest went on the watch. None of them knew where Barrows' swooping flight might pause. The Texas officers kept up their valiant search, fighting hard against the discouragement they felt as they continued day after day, following numerous leads and tips, all of which proved worthless. A month after the raid on the Texas prison farm, there appeared in southwestern newspapers a startling announcement. A raid of huge proportions on the Cookson Hills area of eastern Oklahoma, notorious for its criminal hideouts, had been dropped. That was the first suggestion the general public had of the amazing event that was to follow. The announcement was made for a purpose. All right, let's set the scene here. A drizzling rain was falling over the jack oak timbered Cookson Hills the night of February 17th. It half concealed a tremendous activity. Trucks, loaded with men wearing the uniform of the National Guard, were rolling over the rough roads. There were scores of motor cars filled with men in civilian garb. Many of the cars bore police insignia. 4 whole companies of the Oklahoma National Guard were on the move upon the orders of Governor William Murray. Altogether, 1,000 men, federal, state, and county officers, were converging toward prearranged points. The Great Drive was about to start. Information had been received that Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, and Raymond Hamilton were hiding in the hills. The huge posse was under orders to bring them in. Also sought were Charles Pretty Boy Floyd and other lesser criminals. The area comprising the Cookson Hills is about 60 miles long and about 40 miles wide, 2,400 square miles of some of the wildest, most inaccessible country in America. Cookson Hills lies along the Oklahoma-Arkansas line, north from the Arkansas River, which crosses the state line at Fort Smith, Arkansas. An area without paved highway, it was historic as a hiding place for criminals since the days of the James Boys. It spread into 4 Oklahoma counties: Cherokee, Adair, Sequoia, and Muskogee. Bases of operation had been established at Tahlequah, Muskogee, Stillwell, and Silasau. 0 hour. The dawn of Sunday, February 18th, found 1,000 peace officers either on the march or at their posts guarding paths and roads into the hills. Oklahoma had answered the challenge of the Barrow Pack. The orders were shoot to kill. The most perfectly organized and one of the largest manhunts in the history of Oklahoma was underway. The drizzling rain had turned to snow during the night, but before dawn the clouds broke. Starting at the first suggestion of daylight, the great raid on the Cookson Hills of eastern Oklahoma was well along when the sun rose over the trees. February 18, 1934 was an anxious day for law enforcement. Joplin Chief of Detectives Ed Portley remained close to his office, hoping to receive a message that the murderous pair, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, had been captured or killed. Would the Oklahoma trap for them and Charles Pretty Boy Floyd be successful? In their heart of hearts, police feared that it would not. They realized the tremendous task that the Oklahoma authorities had undertaken. A posse of 1,000 men seemed large. The participating officers were well equipped, perhaps even better armed than the dangerous Barrow Pack, but it seemed impossible to cover thoroughly the area of 2,400 square miles with its thousands of impregnable hideouts. Still, the chance of a fortunate break buoyed hopes. A car rushed down a rutted road near Weber's Falls. As it neared a barricade manned by Oklahoma National Guardsmen, the machine seemed to gain speed. An officer shouted a command. Crews leapt to Army machine guns set up on both sides of the road. The guns were trained on the approaching car. The officer raised his automatic. The driver of the car apparently intended to ram the barricade of logs. The officer saw that a woman was in the front seat. He shouted, "Ready! It may be Barrow!" With only seconds to spare before crashing into the logs, the driver jammed on his brakes. The car skidded sideways across the road. Under the threat of the machine guns, a man and 3 women, their hands in the air, climbed out of the car. None of the occupants resembled members of the Barrow gang, but the officer informed them that they were under arrest. Sheriff Stanley Rogers of Oklahoma County, one of the officers in command of the posse unit at Muskogee, was informed of the arrest. Sheriff Rogers, who is the president of the Organization of Peace Officers in Oklahoma, rushed to the scene when he learned of several articles found in the motor car. Only one man was in the car, but in the rear seat were 2 men's overcoats. A briefcase found under the coats contained several shotgun shells loaded with No. 2 buckshot and a handful of .45 caliber pistol bullets. A hasty check revealed that the man and the 3 women under arrest did not have criminal records. Following their release a few hours later, Sheriff Rogers made this announcement. "We believe we missed Ford Bradshaw by a hair's breadth. We are positive that the car was sent ahead by Bradshaw, a notorious bank robber, as a decoy. There's every reason to believe that Bradshaw is still in the hills. At about the time of the incident near Weber's Falls, there was a similar occurrence near Muskogee. A car broke down on a barricade erected on the road between Vion and Tahlequah. Disregarding the weapons of the officers at the barricade, the driver crashed his car through the heavy planks. The officers swung around and started firing at the fleeing car. Machine guns and rifles were spitting lead. The car gained distance, 50 yards, 100 yards. A rear tire exploded, then another. Lurching wildly, the machine toppled into a ditch. Before the occupants could clamber from the disabled car, it was surrounded by a ring of determined officers. "All right, we give up," said one of the men as he climbed out. A federal agent lifted a revolver from the speaker's pocket as the second man was getting out of the car with his hands elevated. The daring display by the arrested men had led the officials to believe they'd captured two of the major criminals of Cookson Hills. They were disappointed. At Sallisaw, it was revealed that the men were not associated with the Barrow or Floyd gangs. The armed man had been sought sometime for questioning. Such were the reports coming from Cookson Hills. 19 persons, including 6 women, were arrested in the raid. Peace officers throughout the Southwest felt keenly the disappointment of the leaders of the big raid. Tired and wet from its day in the slushy brush, the army started home after dark. Not one major criminal had been arrested. Although failing in its principal objectives, the raid was in effect a success because the spirit and intensity behind the huge posse had a terrorizing effect on the criminals of the Badlands. However, there was only one concrete result of the raid worth mentioning. Ford Bradshaw, believed recently to have become a lieutenant of Floyd, apparently no longer considered the Cookson Hills area a safe hiding place. From confidential sources, Oklahoma authorities learned that he fled soon after the search died down. A few days later, this young outlaw was cornered by deputies in a roadhouse southwest of Fort Smith. In attempting to fight his way clear, Bradshaw was shot to death. Now that the big raid had become merely another incident in the far-flung search for Clyde Barrow, law enforcement could not help but wonder where he would strike again. If he had been in eastern Oklahoma, it seemed probable that he would flee northward from that area. Orders were issued for a close watch. A motorcar dealer in Springfield, Missouri, reported to police in the city that a car had been stolen from the front of his home. He saw the thieves as they drove away. The dealer positively identified Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker, and Raymond Hamilton. There was no identification for a third man with the gang. The warning was broadcast. As Springfield is only 80 miles east of Joplin, Chief of Detectives Ed Portley immediately ordered all available officers to roads entering the city, but the trail was picked up at Galena, miles south of Springfield. Sheriff Seth Tuttle of Stone County and 2 deputies sighted the stolen car speeding westward on Missouri Highway number 44. He wheeled his car about and started in pursuit. Rapidly, he cut down the long lead of the bandit car. The chase continued through Galena, then south. A few miles south of that town, the bandits abandoned the car stolen in Springfield, stealing another which was parked in front of a farmhouse. Sheriff Tuttle instructed his men to continue the chase. He climbed into the abandoned car and rushed back to Galena to notify the Reed Spring, Missouri police. Unless the bandits could be stopped there, the sheriff knew the chance of capture was slight. The trail would be lost in the ravines of the Ozark Mountains. Marshal Dale Davis of Reed Springs received the sheriff's call. He rushed to the highway at a point north of the town. He saw a car approaching from the north. His revolver drawn, Marshal Davis signaled for the speeding car to stop. Hardly slackening its speed, the bandit driver whipped the car into a rutty side road. The skidding wheels threw a shower of gravel down the highway. Deftly, the driver kept control. A few seconds later, the sheriff's car came to a halt at the frantic waving of Marshal Davis. "That way!" Davis shouted, pointing down the side road. "It's a dead-end road! We got him! Let's go!" As the officer's car slid around a sharp turn in the narrow road, they were greeted with a fusillade of machine gun and pistol fire. The bullets plowed into the hood of the car, disabling the ignition system. Equipped only with revolvers, the officers were forced to seek cover. They miraculously escaped injury. Davis and the deputies were unable to fire often as the bandits maintained the barrage of rapid fire. Able to send only a few futile bullets after the bandit car as it retraced its course over the road, the officers were left stranded with their crippled car. Clyde Barrow again had eluded capture. The next day brought startling sequels to the affairs at Springfield and Reed Spring. Joe Gunn, a farmer living near Reed Spring, returned to his home at noon after an absence of almost 24 hours and related an amazing experience. "A car with 2 men and a woman in it stopped and asked me for road directions," Gunn said. "They wanted to go to Springfield. I told them the way and then started to go about my business when one of the men said, 'Get in here.' He had a pistol in his hand. They took me to Springfield where they stole the car. Then there was a wild ride, the officers chasing us. They told me that the officers ought to know me and wouldn't shoot at me, but the officers did not recognize me. The fight near Reed Springs was terrible for me." Gunn was released late that night about 25 miles south of the Missouri line. When he was showing pictures of the killers, the farmer completed the identification of Barrow, Hamilton, and Bonnie. The next development occurred in Kansas, only 200 miles northwest of Berryville, only a few hours after the farmer had been released. Guards on the wall of the Kansas State Penitentiary noticed a Chevrolet sedan circling the prison. In the car were 4 men and a woman. The woman was smoking a cigar. Well, that's Bonnie for you. 2 hours later, prison authorities received reliable information that the same car with Clyde Barrow at the wheel had been parked on a side road near the prison. Radio stations were asked to broadcast a warning to peace officers of eastern Kansas and western Missouri. Heavily armed searching parties were sent out by Warden Lacey Simpson of the Kansas prison and Warden Fred Zerst of the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth, which is only a few miles from the Kansas institution at Lansing. The prison officials remembered rumors in the summer of 1933 that Barrow had planned a raid on the federal prison where one of Barrow's friends was a prisoner. There seemed to be considerable reason to believe that Barrow was in the vicinity of the prisons, but if a delivery had been planned, he'd evidently lost his courage. The trail was lost. The pack again had dropped from sight. The morning of February 27th, a dark-colored motorcar swept into the little town of Lancaster, Texas. The car stopped in front of the R.P. Henry & Sons Bank. 2 men stepped out and entered the car. A woman remained in the car. A few seconds later, the men dashed from the bank and leapt into the car seat of the machine. The car raced wildly down the street, the woman driving. It had disappeared before startled witnesses learned what occurred in the bank. Bank officials announced that $4,138 had been obtained in the holdup. They identified Clyde Barrow and Raymond Hamilton as the bandits. The chase was on again. Time passed without any definite word as to the whereabouts of the outlaw gang. The days following were marked only by the attempted escape of Roy Thornton, Bonnie Parker's former husband, from the Texas State Penitentiary at Huntsville. At 1 o'clock on the morning of March 7th, 5 men crept from their cells in the prison. The convicts had unlocked their cell doors with keys fashioned in the prison machine shop. A few minutes later, the prison was thrown into confusion by the roar of shotguns. 3 of the convicts, attempting to scale the wall, were wounded by buckshot. The other 2, one of whom was Thornton, surrendered quickly. Vigilant guards had frustrated the plot. Warden W. Wade said that Thornton, a life-termer, had plotted the escape because of his affection for Bonnie and his desire to rejoin her. "The man is crazy over that woman," Warden Wade said. The next morning, hundreds of miles distant from the Huntsville prison, a man burst excitedly into the office of Sheriff W.A. Wantland of Franklin County, Kansas. The man, whose name is withheld by Sheriff Wantland, told of a strange experience. He said he was hitchhiking on United States Highway No. 73 West near Ottawa, Kansas, when he was picked up by a man and a woman in a Ford V8 sedan bearing an Oklahoma license. The couple asked him directions to Osawatomie, Kansas, and then let him out of the car a few miles down the highway. The sheriff's visitor told of 2 sawed-off shotguns in the car and of a revolver in a holster strapped to the steering wheel. The description of the couple seemed familiar to Sheriff Wantland. After viewing several pictures, the hitchhiker found that he had been given a ride by, you guessed it, Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker. Needless to say, this information caused a renewal of the search for Barrow in Kansas. It was at about this time that a series of some 12 bank holdups started occurring in that state. But except for one vague instance, neither Barrow nor Bonnie Parker were identified in connection with any of those robberies. That one vague instance was in connection with the $25,000 holdup on March 12th of Exchange National and the Exchange State Banks, which occupy the same building in Atchison, Kansas. 8 employees were kidnapped as hostages, and the chief of police, Willard Linville, was wounded in a battle with the bandits. Several persons reported to Atchison police that they'd seen a woman who was smoking a cigar in an Atchison hotel. The description given of the woman was somewhat similar to that of Bonnie Parker. However, the Barrow gang was ultimately not connected with the holdup. Business houses in the little town of West Texas, that's right, not the region, the town is actually called West Texas, were enjoying the usual rush of Saturday, the morning of March 31st. Few of the many persons on the street paid particular notice to a motor car that drew up to the front of the State National Bank. There was a red-haired young woman at the steering wheel. A young man stepped from the car and sauntered into the bank. Once inside, he whipped out a bulky object he had concealed under his coat. It was a sub-machine gun. A moment later, the man dashed from the bank and piled into the car. Bank officials ran to the streets shouting for a chase to be organized. The lone bandit had scooped up $1,862 from the tills. The alarm spread over central Texas. Was it Barrow? Witnesses to the holdup viewed pictures of the killer. He was not the bandit. The man was Raymond Hamilton, the witnesses said. They were unable to identify the woman. Posses of 30 officers spread out over the roads. 30 minutes after the holdup, the trail of the bandit car was found. A farmer said he'd pulled the car from a mud hole on the county road east of West. East of West? Really? Again, West Texas is the name of the town. There was a man and a red-haired woman in the car. The man answered Hamilton's description. Courting death on the slippery road, 2 carloads of deputy sheriffs dashed out in pursuit of the bandit couple. As they neared the village of Thelma, the officers came upon an amazing scene. 2 farmers were standing beside a wrecked car. They were waving frantically at the officers. The motors cut off, the deputies heard the wild sobs of a small child who was leaning against the wrecked car. "Mother, mother," the child cried. "My mother is gone." God, that's tragic. The farmers said they'd been attracted to the scene by a loud crash. They found a man and a woman standing by the car, which had skidded from the road and plunged into an embankment. "Mister, we gotta get out of here in a hurry." The man addressed one of the farmers. "Have you got a chain you could tie to your car?" The farmers said they had no chain in the car, but volunteered to go to the nearby farmhouse where they could obtain one. They climbed over the embankment and cut across the field. About 15 minutes later, they returned, carrying between them a long log chain. As they approached the edge of the embankment, the farmers heard the scream of a woman. Dropping the chain, they rushed forward. One of the farmers, who had a shotgun in his hand, released the safety catch on the weapon. They heard the man say, "Lady, we've robbed a bank and we have to have your car." Apparently sensing the return of the farmers, the man released the struggling woman and dived for the wrecked machine. A second car was standing in the center of the road. The man pulled a machine gun from the car and pointed it toward the startled farmers. "Drop that shotgun," he shouted. The farmer hesitated. A score of bullets from the machine gun ripped up the lip of the embankment at his feet. The shotgun tumbled down into the water of the ditch. Defenseless, the farmers were unable to protest against what followed. They recognized the woman driver of the second car. She was Mrs. Cam Gunter, an attractive young matron of Mexia, a town east of Thelma. In her car was her 4-year-old son, Jolly. The man and his woman companion pulled the little boy from Mrs. Gunter's car and calmly proceeded to transfer several weapons from their wrecked car. The frightened mother crouched at the side of the road, her arms around the boy. Finally, the bandits appeared ready to leave. The man said to Mrs. Gunter, "You're going with us." The horrified young woman was forced into the front seat of the car between the bandit and his woman companion. The child was left behind. "You take care of the kid," the man told the farmers. "We can't use him." With the man driving the car started eastward towards Mexia, the farmers plunged down the side of the bank, both attempting to find the shotgun. By the time it had been retrieved, the bandits and their hostage were out of sight. The deputy sheriffs did not tarry long in obtaining the bare details of this new outrage. Taking the child with them, they raced to Mexia with a report of the kidnapping. All police officers in the central part of the huge state were notified of the new turn. Radio stations in the larger cities broadcast a warning that there was an innocent person with the robbers. Sheriffs and police chiefs rushed additional men into the field. An outraged citizenry formed determined posses. For 2 hours, news of the affair was kept from Mr. Gunter of Mexia. It was hoped that the searchers would find Mrs. Gunter unharmed and thus save her husband from shock and worry. When he was notified, the husband found willing volunteers for another posse. Hour after hour, the search went on. A watch was kept over all main highways and most of the possible dirt roads. Every possible hideout was searched. Even after many of the other searching parties were forced to stop by exhaustion, the infuriated husband drove his party on. At midnight, there had been no word. By that time, it had been definitively established that Raymond Hamilton, robber of the bank at West, was the kidnapper. Hamilton, the desperate escaped convict, was a known killer, and perhaps even then he was keeping a rendezvous with Clyde Barrows. It was no wonder that the hope of again seeing Mrs. Gunter alive was waning. When dawn came, a new posse took up the search. It was Sunday, April 1st. April Fool's Day. It was a dark, sad Easter for the husband and son of Mrs. Gunter and the young woman's many friends. The one topic of conversation in the churches of Mexia that morning was the fate of the young mother. All right, we're going to stop there. Tune in this Thursday, September 8th, for part 6 of Wheels, Barrows, and Blood, the Badlands romance of Bonnie and Clyde. And remember, friendships are built when you spend quality time together doing something you care about. I know it's Sunday, and I'd like to thank all of you for spending quality time with me. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being my friend. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family. Tell strangers. Leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.